The dog showed up on Caroline Keating's porch 3 days before she had nothing left to eat, and somehow that scraggly, amber-furred hound became the one thing standing between her and complete despair. She had found him shivering beneath the broken step of the small homestead she had shared with her late husband, Thomas Keating, for 2 years before a fever took him in the spring of 1878. The dog was lean and dirty, his ribs pressing against his fur like the fingers of a hand trying to push through thin cloth. Caroline understood that feeling intimately. She had 17 cents to her name, a half-empty sack of cornmeal, and a grief so heavy it had settled into her bones like winter cold. She could not afford to keep the dog, but she also could not bring herself to turn him away. So she split what little she had with him, letting him curl at the foot of her bed while the Kansas wind howled outside the cracked wooden walls of her cabin. For 3 days she fed him the scraps she could spare and talked to him in the evenings, the way she used to talk to Thomas, telling him things she would never say to another person. She told him about the loneliness that woke her before dawn. She told him about the way she had begun to ration her cornmeal down to a single thin cake each morning. She told him she was afraid, and somehow the dog's steady brown eyes made her feel slightly less alone in the world. She called him Copper for the color of his fur, though she knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that he did not belong to her. On the fourth morning she found the collar half buried beneath the porch step. It was a plain leather band, worn soft with age, and stamped into the inside of it were 2 words burned with a branding iron: Walker Ranch. She held it for a long time, turning it over in her hands while the Kansas sun climbed the sky and the flat prairie around her glittered with dew. She recognized the name. Everyone in Hayes County recognized the name. Abraham Walker ran the largest cattle operation in the surrounding county, a spread of land stretching south of the Smoky Hill River that his father had started, and that Abraham had built into something substantial in the years since his father passed. She had never spoken to the man directly, had only seen him from a distance at the general store in the town of Millard Creek, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his middle 30s with dark hair and the kind of quiet manner that made people step aside when he walked through a door. She looked at the collar and then she looked at Copper, who sat watching her with those patient amber eyes, and she made a decision that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She could not keep a dog that did not belong to her. She had enough trouble keeping herself. And besides, if she made the walk out to Walker Ranch, perhaps she might find some piece of work that could give her a few dollars to last through the coming weeks. She was not too proud to ask. She had passed the point of pride sometime around the middle of August, when she had eaten the last of the salt pork and realized that the world did not particularly care whether she survived or not. She put on the cleanest dress she owned, which was not very clean, and brushed her dark hair back and pinned it as neatly as she could, and she tied the leather collar around Copper's neck and started walking south through the tall grass toward the Walker Ranch. It was a longer walk than she had estimated, nearly 4 miles along a rutted dirt road that wound between low hills covered in switchgrass and late summer wildflowers. The sun was already fierce by mid-morning, and Caroline's stomach twisted with hunger before she had covered half the distance. She kept her chin up and kept walking, Copper trotting cheerfully beside her on a length of rope she had looped through his collar, his tail swinging with a happiness she envied. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and the warm, heavy scent of cattle and hay, and beneath it something else, something savory that she identified after a moment as beans and bacon cooking over an open fire. Her stomach clenched so hard she nearly stumbled on the road. She pressed one hand briefly against her midsection and forced herself to keep moving. The Walker Ranch emerged from behind a low rise as she crested the hill, and it was a sight that made her stop for a moment. It was not a rough, thrown-together operation like so many homesteads she had seen in Kansas. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from limestone blocks, the kind of house that spoke of permanence and intention. There was a wide front porch running the full length of the building, and behind the house stood a large barn painted a deep red, and beyond that she could see the angular shapes of a bunkhouse and several outbuildings. 3 or 4 cowboys were visible at various distances, moving between the barn and the corrals themselves held a dozen horses and a small herd of cattle that shifted and lowed in the morning heat. She walked down the rise toward the front gate, which was a simple wooden affair set between 2 limestone posts, and Copper pulled on the rope with sudden recognition, his whole body wriggling with excitement. He knew this place. He was home. She stopped at the gate and stood for a moment, suddenly very aware of her worn dress and her dusty shoes and the way the wind was pulling strands of hair loose from her pins. She was painfully conscious of how she must look to anyone watching from the house, a gaunt woman in faded calico leading a dog on a rope, clearly poor, clearly desperate, clearly out of her depth. But she thought of her empty larder and her 17 cents and Thomas lying cold in the ground behind their cabin, and she opened the gate and walked toward the house. She had barely made it halfway up the front path when the door opened, and the man himself stepped out onto the porch. Abraham Walker was even larger than she had realized from a distance, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from genuine physical labor rather than mere size, his shoulders filling out a plain work shirt, his dark hair pushing back from a face that was weathered and angular, and, she noticed with some surprise, considerably younger looking up close than she had expected. She had heard people speak of him as if he were some established patriarch, but standing there on his own porch he looked perhaps 35 at most, maybe less, with dark eyes that registered surprise the moment they landed on Copper. "Well," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that came from a man who did not often waste words. "There he is." Copper lunged toward him with a bark of pure joy, and Caroline held the rope with both hands to keep from being dragged forward. Abraham Walker came down the porch steps and crouched without a second's hesitation, catching the dog in both hands and ruffling his ears with a genuine warmth that surprised her, a smile breaking across that weathered face and making him look younger still. "You fool dog," he said softly. "I looked for you 3 days." He stayed crouched for a moment, letting Copper lick at his face, and then he looked up at Caroline with those dark eyes. "He yours?" "No," she said, and was proud of how steady her voice came out. "I found him under my porch step about 4 days ago. He had your collar in the dirt nearby." He straightened up and studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was taking in everything she had tried to hide. The thinness of her face, the state of her dress, the slight unsteadiness of someone who had not eaten a proper meal in some days. "You walked here?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "From where?" "The Keating place, about 4 miles north, just off the Millard Road." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or something more careful than that. "Keating," he said. "Thomas Keating's place." "I was his wife," she said. "I am his widow. My name is Caroline." A brief silence settled between them, and in it she heard the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the windmill behind the barn and the way the grass moved in a long, slow wave across the hillside. "I heard about Thomas," Abraham said, and there was genuine quietness in it, not the hollow politeness of someone offering condolences out of obligation. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Keating." "Thank you," she said. She was holding the rope still, though Copper had come back to sit beside her boot as if unsure which of them he belonged to at that particular moment. Abraham Walker looked at the dog and then at her, and something in his face settled into a decision. "You hungry?" he asked. The directness of it caught her so off guard that she very nearly said no out of sheer reflex. The word formed in her throat and she swallowed it back, because she thought of the cornmeal she had not yet rationed for the day and the long walk back through the heat, and she said, "Yes." Just that one word, honest and simple, and she watched something in his expression ease, as if the admission had cost her something he could see. "Come inside," he said. "I was just putting dinner together." She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door, and the interior of the house was cool and smelled of pine wood and beeswax, and the rich, mouth-watering scent of something long cooked on a stove. The main room was larger than her entire cabin, with a stone fireplace on the west wall and a long pine table in the center and bookshelves along one wall that surprised her, crowded with actual books, their spines cracked and well-used. There were no frills to the place. It was a man's house, functional and honest, but it was built with care and the furniture was well-made and the floors were swept clean. Abraham moved through the room to the kitchen at the back, and Caroline followed him because there was nothing else to do, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and watched him lift the lid from a large iron pot on the wood stove. The smell that rose from that pot was so intensely good, thick beef stew with vegetables, that her vision actually blurred for a moment, and she put one hand against the doorframe. "Sit down," he said, without looking at her, and the instruction was so matter-of-fact, so free of pity, that she found it easier to obey than she might have if he had looked at her with sympathy. She sat at the small kitchen table, and Copper settled at her feet as if he had made up his mind, and Abraham Walker set a bowl of stew in front of her so full that it very nearly slopped over the edge, and beside it a thick slice of cornbread and a glass of cold water from the pump, and he did it all with the calm efficiency of a man who fed people without making a production of it. He sat across from her with his own bowl and looked at her steadily. "Eat," he said. She ate. She tried to eat with some dignity and not too quickly, but the first spoonful of that stew hit her empty stomach like sunlight after a long, dark winter, and by the third spoonful she had stopped pretending to have any dignity at all, and was simply eating with the focused, concentrated gratitude of someone who had not had a real meal in more than a week. She was distantly aware that he was watching her with no expression that she could read, and she was too hungry to be embarrassed by it. When she looked up after clearing 2/3 of the bowl, she said, "I apologize. I should explain." "You don't need to explain anything," he said. "I haven't eaten properly in several days," she said anyway, because she felt she owed him the honesty. "I've been trying to stretch what I have, and it's run shorter than I managed. I didn't come here looking for charity. I came to return your dog." "I know that," he said. "Eat the rest of your bowl." She ate the rest of the bowl. She ate the cornbread. She drank all the water. And when she set the glass down and looked at him across the table, she felt something she had not felt in months, a small, fragile warmth somewhere in the center of her chest, like an ember that someone had cupped their hands around. "Thank you," she said. "That was the best meal I've had since before Thomas passed." He nodded. He had a way of accepting gratitude without deflecting it or magnifying it, just receiving it plainly, and she found that more comfortable than the elaborate protests she might have expected from some people. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those dark eyes that were, she now noticed, not entirely unreadable. There was something thoughtful in them, something that was working through a calculation she could not quite follow. "You said you were hoping to find work," he said. She had not said that, not in so many words, but she realized she must have been as transparent as glass. "I thought I might ask," she said carefully. "I'm a capable cook and I can sew and I'm not afraid of hard work. I managed a homestead alone for the last several months." "What are you going to do with the Keating place?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Thomas had debt on it when he died and I've been trying to determine what I actually owe. The bank in Millard Creek has been patient, but I suspect their patience has limits." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, "I could use a cook. My last housekeeper left in July to go back east, and I've been managing on my own since then. I've got 7 ranch hands who eat like it's a competition, and my own cooking is functional at best." He paused. "The job would include room and board. There's a room off the kitchen. It's small, but it's clean." Caroline looked at him. She was aware of how this might sound to the people of Millard Creek, a widow taking up residence in a single man's home. She was also aware that she had 17 cents and not much future if she walked back to that empty cabin. "I would want the arrangement to be understood correctly," she said. "I would be working for wages as a housekeeper and cook, nothing beyond that." "That's the arrangement I'm offering," he said, and his voice was so flat and businesslike that she believed him immediately. There was nothing in his manner that suggested anything other than what he said. $2 a week plus room and board. You'd have the kitchen to yourself in the mornings after the hands have eaten, and Sundays are yours. It was more than fair. It was generous, and she suspected he knew it. "I accept," she said. He nodded once, as if the matter were settled, and stood to collect the empty bowls. "I'll have one of the hands drive you back to your place this afternoon to collect what you need. You can start tomorrow morning if you're ready." She helped him wash the bowls because it seemed the right thing to do, and the domestic quietness of it, standing side by side at the kitchen pump, the sound of water and the distant sounds of the ranch outside the window, felt both strange and unexpectedly comfortable. He was not a man who filled silence with talk, and she found she did not mind that at all. She had grown very tired of people who filled silence with noise. Copper stayed in the kitchen, lying against the back wall with his chin on his paws, watching both of them with those amber eyes, his tail doing a slow, satisfied sweep across the floor. She returned the next morning with everything she owned in a single trunk and a flour sack, which was not very much. One of the hands, a young man named Dill who could not have been more than 19 and had a face as open and unguarded as a field, carried the trunk in and installed it in the small room off the kitchen without a word about its lightness. The room was plain, with a narrow cot and a washstand and a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden, but it was clean and solid, and she stood in it for a moment after Dill left and pressed both hands flat against the cool limestone walls and let herself feel, for the first time in months, something that might eventually become hope. She was up before dawn the next morning. She had always been an early riser, and she explored the kitchen with a thorough practicality, inventorying what was there, what was needed, what she could do with what she found. The larder was well stocked in the way that a man with income but no particular skill in the kitchen stocks things. Large quantities of staples, flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, cornmeal, dried fruit, but not much variety in the way of the small things that made meals into something worth remembering. She made a mental list of what she needed from the general store in Millard Creek and started the coffee and began on a proper breakfast. When the hands came in at sunrise, she had eggs and bacon and fried cornbread and a pot of strong coffee waiting, and she watched 7 hungry men sit down at the long table in the main room and fall completely silent for nearly a full minute after the first bites, the kind of silence that is actually a very loud compliment. One of the older hands, a man named Grady with a salt and pepper beard and 30 years of ranching behind his eyes, looked at her across the table with an expression of pure wonder and said, "Ma'am, wherever you've been all our lives, we are very glad you're here." There was laughter, and it was good honest laughter, and Caroline felt herself smile for the first time in so long that the muscles of her face felt strange with it. Abraham Walker came in last, as she had already noticed was his habit, and ate with his men at the table rather than separately, which she thought said something about him. He ate what was in front of him with the focused appreciation of a man who had been eating his own mediocre cooking for 2 months, and when he finished he looked at her and said simply, "Good," and she understood that from him that was considerable praise. The days fell into a rhythm that surprised her with its comfort. She rose before dawn and prepared breakfast, then sent the hands off and cleaned the kitchen, and prepared what she needed for the midday meal, which was eaten at noon when the men came in from the morning's work. She had afternoons for her own tasks, mending and baking, and the vegetable garden behind the kitchen, which had gone somewhat wild over the summer, and which she began to bring back into order with a systematic attention that she found genuinely satisfying. Evenings she prepared supper, and after supper the hands went to the bunkhouse, and the house grew quiet. It was in those quiet evenings that she first began to truly know Abraham Walker. He did not seek her company in an obvious way. He was a man who moved through his world with a kind of careful restraint, as if he had learned at some point to be cautious with his own wants. But she would find him in the kitchen after supper, ostensibly for another cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, reading one of those crack-spined books from the shelf in the main room while she finished the last of the washing up. He never asked her to sit with him, but there was something in the way he arranged himself that was not quite solitary either. The way he would glance up when she came near and then back down at his book. The way he would ask, in his direct and unceremonious manner, what she thought about something he had read. She discovered early that he read everything with the same attention, agricultural reports and dime novels, and a tattered copy of the collected speeches of Abraham Lincoln, for whom, she later learned, he had in fact been named, his father having been a particular admirer. He had opinions about everything he read, and he offered them without apology, and she found herself offering her own opinions in return, tentatively at first, and then with more confidence as she realized he received her thoughts not as a novelty, but as a genuine contribution to a conversation between equals. One evening in late September, about 3 weeks after she had come to the ranch, he looked up from his book and said, out of what seemed like nowhere, "Do you miss it, the cabin?" She considered the question honestly. "I miss Thomas," she said. "I don't miss the cabin particularly. Is that a terrible thing to say?" "No," he said. "It's an honest thing." "The cabin was always more Thomas's dream than mine," she said. "He wanted to homestead, and I went with him because I loved him and because I was 23 years old and it seemed like an adventure. But Kansas is hard country for small homesteading. He worked himself near to death trying to make it work." She paused. "The fever finished what the work started, I think." Abraham was quiet for a moment, his book closed on the table under his broad hand. "How old are you now?" 25, she said. "In November," he nodded. She noticed that he did not offer his own age in return, but she already knew from what she had heard that he was 34, nearly 10 years her senior, though she had long since stopped thinking of him as particularly older than herself. There was something in the quality of his attention, the directness and the patience of it, that made age seem like an irrelevant measurement. "What brought your family to Kansas?" she asked, because it seemed fair to turn the question, and because she was genuinely curious. "My father came west in 1860, he said. "He believed in this land when most people thought it was nothing but grass and wind. He was right in the end. Cattle country. He started with 200 head and a lot of stubbornness, and by the time he died in 1871 he had something real here." He looked at the table for a moment. "I was 27 when he died. I've been working beside him for 10 years already. Taking it over was less of a decision than a continuation." "Do you have other family?" she asked. "A brother in Colorado. We write when we think of it." He paused. "You?" "My parents are in Missouri. I have a sister in St. Louis." She folded the dish towel over the rack. "I've been too proud to write them how things have actually been. I suspect they know anyway." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she had the sense again that he was seeing more than she was saying. "Pride is a useful tool," he said, "up until it starts costing you more than it's worth." She thought about that. "I'm trying to learn that lesson," she said. Autumn came to the Kansas plains with a suddenness and a beauty that always managed to catch her off guard, the grass going to gold and rust, the skies deepening to an impossible blue, the mornings arriving with a cold sharpness that smelled like wood smoke and frozen earth. She found herself standing at the kitchen window in the early mornings, hands wrapped around her coffee cup, watching the light come up over the hills while Copper sat at her feet, and feeling something she was almost afraid to name. She realized, happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of someone whose life has no trouble in it, but the deeper, harder-won happiness of someone who has been through a long, dark passage and come out the other side into light. The ranch was alive in a way that the cabin had never quite been, filled with the sounds of horses and cattle and men working, and in the evenings, the occasional music from the bunkhouse where someone played a guitar with more enthusiasm than skill. She was part of something larger than her own grief. The work was good and honest, and when she set a meal on the table and watched 7 men eat it with satisfaction, she felt a simple pride that had nothing to do with vanity. And then there was Abraham. She was careful with her feelings in those early weeks, careful in the way that a woman who has been hungry for a long time learns to be careful about the first sight of food, knowing that what looks like abundance might be misread by a desperate heart. She watched him because she could not entirely help it. She watched the way he moved through the ranch, unhurried and certain, the way he spoke to his hands, with a directness and a fundamental respect that she noticed was not universal among employers of that era and place. She watched the way he handled the animals, horses and cattle alike, with a patience and a quietness that seemed to come from a genuine understanding rather than technique. She watched the way he was with Copper, who had definitively and without apology decided that he belonged to both of them equally, which in practice meant that he spent his days following Abraham around the ranch and his evenings in the kitchen at Caroline's feet. She was in the kitchen garden one afternoon in early October, pulling up the last of the summer vegetables before the hard frost came, her hands dirty and her hair falling loose from its pins, when she heard Abraham's voice behind her and stood up so quickly she nearly lost her balance. He caught her arm without thinking, one hand closing around her elbow with a steadiness that stopped her from going over sideways, and they stood for a moment very close together while the October wind moved the grass around them, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand through her sleeve and the particular quality of the pause between them. He let go of her arm. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you." "No, I was miles away," she said, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and was aware that she must look like something the wind had arranged. "I was thinking about putting up the last of the squash." He looked at the basket of vegetables beside her. Then he crouched down and picked it up, a completely natural gesture, not making a show of helping, just picking up the basket because it needed picking up, and stood and held it out to her. She took it, and their fingers touched briefly on the handle, and neither of them said anything about it. But she carried that small warmth with her through the rest of the afternoon, like something she had found unexpectedly in a coat pocket. She wrote to her mother and sister in October, a long letter that was more honest than anything she had written in the previous year. She told them about Thomas, fully and honestly, not the careful edited version she had sent before, but the real story of the fever and the months afterward and the debt and the real shape of her struggle. She told them about walking to Walker Ranch to return the stray dog. She told them about the job and what it was like and the fact that she was eating properly again. She did not tell them about Abraham Walker beyond the basic facts of employment, because she did not know what she would say and because she was not entirely sure yet what there was to tell. Her mother wrote back within 3 weeks, a letter full of relief and the particular warmth of a parent who has been worrying from a distance and is now reassured. Her sister wrote separately, characteristically more direct, and asked a series of pointed questions about the nature of her employer and the exact circumstances of the living arrangement that made Caroline both laugh and redden, alone in her small room with the letter. She wrote back and told her sister to mind her business. But the question had planted something in her that she could not entirely uproot, and she found herself paying a different kind of attention in the evenings in the kitchen, looking at Abraham across the table, where the lamplight softened the weathered angles of his face and caught the occasional silver thread in his dark hair, and asking herself things she did not quite have the courage to ask out loud. The answer, when she let herself examine it honestly, was simple and complicated and somewhat terrifying. She was falling in love with him. She was falling in love with the way he listened, fully and without hurry, as if whatever she said was worth his complete attention. She was falling in love with the small, dry humor that appeared rarely and without announcement, a turn of phrase or a look that made her laugh when she had not seen it coming. She was falling in love with the fact that he had given her exactly what he had said he would, honest work and fair wages and a home, without ever asking for anything she had not offered, without ever pressing against the careful boundaries of their arrangement. She was falling in love with the man who had crouched on his porch steps and ruffled his dog's ears and looked up at a gaunt, desperate widow on his front path and seen, not a problem, but a person who needed a meal. She was careful with it. She kept it to herself, folded it up small and set it aside, and got on with her work. She had no confidence that the feeling was returned. He was courteous and kind, and she thought, sometimes, that there was something warm in the way he watched her, but he was also a man of such fundamental restraint that she genuinely could not tell whether what she thought she saw was real or the wishful invention of a lonely woman. October turned to November, and on the 1st of November, Caroline turned 26 years old, and she did not mention it to anyone because birthdays had never been things she made much of. She came downstairs in the morning and found Abraham already in the kitchen, which was unusual. He was standing at the stove with a look of intense and somewhat precarious concentration, and on the kitchen table there was a cake. It was not a beautiful cake. It was slightly lopsided and the icing was more generous on one side than the other, but it was unmistakably a cake, and on the table beside it was a small package wrapped in brown paper. She stopped in the doorway and stared at him. He looked at her over his shoulder with the expression of a man who has done something he is not entirely sure was wise, but is committed to it now. "Grady told me your birthday was today," he said. Grady knows everything that happens on this ranch, which is either very useful or very annoying depending on the circumstance. He nodded at the cake. "I'm a functional cook. I said that when I hired you. The cake is functional." She looked at the cake and then at him, and she felt the thing she had been keeping folded up and set aside do something she could not control, a warmth that moved outward through her chest and reached her eyes, and she blinked very quickly and said, "You made me a cake." "Don't read too much into the lopsidedness," he said. She laughed. It came out suddenly and with genuine delight, a laugh she had not expected and could not have stopped, and she pressed one hand over her mouth and looked at him with bright eyes, and something happened in his expression then. Something that cracked the careful restraint she had been trying to read for weeks. Something that looked, for just a moment, like pure and uncomplicated wanting. He cleared his throat and turned back to the stove. "There's coffee," he said. "Open the package." She opened the package. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of paper, was a small book, a collection of poems by Emily Dickinson, new enough that the binding still cracked when she opened it. She had mentioned 2 weeks ago in one of their evening kitchen conversations that she had read Dickinson in school and loved her. She had not thought he was particularly listening at that moment because he had been studying a ledger book at the time. He had been listening. She held the book in both hands and she said, "Abraham," and the use of his given name, which she had never used before, always Mrs. Keating and Mr. Walker, drew him around to look at her, and she said, "Thank you." She stopped. She started again. "No one has done anything this kind for me in a very long time." He looked at her steadily. The morning light was coming in through the kitchen window and it fell across both of them, and in it she could see the particular carefulness of his expression, the same carefulness she had been watching for weeks, the restraint of a man who is holding himself at a careful distance from something he wants very much. "You should be done kind things for," he said. "That's not a remarkable observation. It's just a fact." She looked down at the book and then back up at him. "I think," she said, and her heart was beating quite hard, "that I have been very careful these past weeks to make sure our arrangement was what you said it was. And I have been very careful not to feel things that might complicate it." She stopped. "I'm not sure I can continue being quite that careful." A long beat of silence. The coffee bubbled gently on the stove. Copper, who had been asleep under the table, lifted his head and looked between them with the patient attention of a creature who understands more than he is given credit for. Abraham set down the coffee pot. He turned fully to face her, and the restraint in his face had shifted into something else, something open and careful and entirely serious. "Caroline," he said, and the way he said her name was different from anything she had heard from him before, quieter, with a weight in it. I told myself I would not say anything because you came here in a difficult situation and I did not want you to feel. He started again. I did not want you to feel that anything in this house depended on you feeling a particular way about me. I don't feel that, she said quietly. I never felt that. Good, he said. He was still standing very still, as if he was not sure yet whether to move. Then I want to say something I have been not saying for about 6 weeks. She waited. I think you are remarkable, he said. I think you are the most capable and honest and alive person I have had in this house in my entire life on this ranch. I think about you constantly, and I am not accustomed to thinking about anything constantly that isn't cattle or weather. The corner of his mouth shifted, just slightly, the small dry humor she had come to love. And I would very much like to know if you might feel anything like that in return. Caroline Keating set the book of poems carefully down on the kitchen table and closed the space between them and said, I walked 4 miles to return your stray dog, Abraham Walker, and I have been hoping every single day since that you would say exactly that. She did not know afterward which of them moved first. She thought later that it was probably both of them at once, and that the meeting in the middle was the truest thing about it. He kissed her with a gentleness that she would not have predicted from a man of his size and his silence, careful and unhurried, one hand curved around her face, and she felt something give way in her chest, something she had been holding braced against the cold for so long that she had forgotten it could ever unclench. When he pulled back, he looked at her with those dark eyes, and there was nothing restrained in them at all. I'm glad you found the collar, he said. She laughed again, soft and breathless. So am I. They ate the lopsided birthday cake with their morning coffee, and it was, she had to admit, functional, exactly as he had warned her. The icing was too sweet and the center was slightly dense, but she ate 2 pieces and said with complete sincerity that it was the best birthday cake she had ever had, and she meant it, because no birthday cake she had ever had been made by Abraham Walker's own 2 hands. What came after was not the sudden rushing together of 2 people in a novel. It was something slower and more real than that, the careful, deliberate unfolding of 2 people who had both already learned something about loss and were not interested in being reckless with what they had found. He began to sit with her in the evenings differently, not pretending any more to be merely in the kitchen for coffee, but openly there for her company, pulling his chair around to her side of the table when she was reading his own book beside her, comfortable in the kind of silence that is not empty but full. He would find reasons to be near the kitchen in the afternoons, not intrusive reasons, never in a way that disrupted her work, but passing through, stopping for a moment to look at something she was doing, asking her opinion on something in the way that had become his particular courtship language, giving her his attention. He showed her the ranch properly. He had, she realized, been waiting to do this. And now he took her on horseback through the full extent of Walker land, the southern pastures where the cattle grazed in the last autumn warmth, the northern range where the grass grew longest, the section of the Smoky Hill River that cut through the eastern edge of his property and ran bright and cold over limestone ledges in the October light. She had grown up with horses in Missouri but had not ridden in years, and he watched her find her seat again without comment, only once reaching over to correct something about her grip on the reins, his hand covering hers briefly, and then nodding when she had it right. This is beautiful country, she said, looking out over the long grass with the river below them, the sky so big and open above the flat land that it felt like being inside something, not outside. It is, he said. He was looking at the land with the expression of someone who has looked at it 10,000 times and still finds it worth looking at. My father used to say that people who called Kansas empty had never actually seen it. He said empty was what you called something when you didn't know how to look at it yet. She thought about that. He sounds like he was a good man. He was. Difficult sometimes in the way that people with strong opinions can be, but good, yes. He paused. You would have liked him, I think. He respected people who worked hard and said what they thought. She looked at him sideways and caught the edge of a smile. "Are you saying I say what I think?" "I'm saying it's a quality I admire," he said. November brought a hard early frost and then a succession of cold, clear days that were some of the finest weather of the year, the sky an aching blue and the frozen grass crackling underfoot in the mornings, the air so clean and sharp it tasted like cold metal. Caroline made her first big batch of preserves from the last of the fall harvest, filling the cellar shelves with jars of tomato and corn and squash, and Abraham came down to the cellar one afternoon and stood looking at the rows of sealed jars with an expression that she could only describe as moved. "My mother used to do this," he said, "every fall. I haven't had a full cellar like this since before she died." "When did she die?" Caroline asked gently. 1868. I was 24. He looked at the jars for a moment more, then at her. "This house has needed someone who cared about it for a long time." She understood what he was saying, and she felt it in her chest, the weight and the warmth of it together. She said, "I care about it." He looked at her in the cellar light, and something in his face was very open and very sure. He said, "I know you do." And then he said quietly, "I care about you, Caroline, more than I have known what to do with since about the second week you were here." "The second week," she said. "The second week. You made apple pie on a Tuesday for no particular reason and left a piece for me on the windowsill because you knew I'd come through the kitchen late from the South Range. And I sat down at the kitchen table at 9 in the evening with the last piece of apple pie in the county, and I thought, this is what I have been missing in this house for my entire adult life." She laughed softly. "An apple pie. You," he said. "I was talking about you." She had no response for that for a moment, because the simple directness of it went straight through every careful defense she had maintained since Thomas died, every wall she had built against the particular vulnerability of feeling for someone. She said, "Abraham, yes, I think I love you." The words came out steadier than she had expected them to. She had not planned to say them, had not decided that this was the moment, but they came anyway, honest and unguarded, and she stood in the cellar with her hands still dusty from the preserving jars and felt the truth of them all the way through. He crossed the cellar in 2 steps and kissed her, not with the carefulness of their first kiss in the kitchen, but with something more certain, both hands on her face, and she kissed him back with everything she had been careful with for 2 months. "I know I love you," he said against her temple when they had come apart enough to breathe. "I've known it for weeks. I was waiting for you to be sure." "I'm sure," she said. "Good," he said, and his arms came around her and she pressed her face against the warm solidity of his chest and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, entirely safe. He asked her to marry him 2 weeks later, on a Sunday in late November, which was her day off. And he did it with a lack of ceremony that was so completely characteristic of him that she loved him more for it than she would have loved any elaborate gesture. They were walking along the east fence line in the afternoon, checking the winter repairs he had made to the rails, and he stopped and looked at her and said, "I want to marry you, Caroline. I want you to stop being the housekeeper and be my wife. I want you to stay here not because there's a job for you here, but because this is your home." She stopped walking. The winter light was low and golden, and the prairie was quiet around them. The dry grass whispered against the fence posts, and Copper stood a little ahead of them on the path and looked back as if impatient with their stopping. "That dog is a romantic," she said. Abraham looked at Copper and then back at her, and there was a light in his eyes that made her heart turn over. "Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said. They were married in the Methodist Church in Millard Creek on a Saturday in December of 1878, 5 months and some odd weeks after a gaunt widow had walked 4 miles through the Kansas heat to return a stray dog to its owner. The church was small and plain and smelled of pine and cold air, and the Reverend Holt performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a frontier minister who had a full afternoon ahead of him. Caroline wore a dress she and the wife of one of the Millard Creek merchants had remade together from a bolt of dark blue wool that Abraham had quietly purchased in advance, and left on her bed without comment. Abraham wore his best jacket and a clean white shirt, and looked both deeply serious and quietly happy in the way that suited him entirely. The ranch hands were all in attendance, scrubbed and in their best clothes, and Grady wept openly and without embarrassment, which made the young hand deal extremely uncomfortable and made everyone else fight not to smile. Abraham's brother Martin made the journey from Colorado and arrived the night before, a slightly shorter, lighter version of Abraham, who looked at Caroline with quick appraising eyes at their first meeting, and then broke into a wide grin and said, "Thank God," with such evident relief that she burst out laughing, and Abraham gave his brother a look that would have withered someone less secure in his affections. Caroline's mother and sister could not make the journey from Missouri in time, though her mother's letter, which arrived the week before the wedding, made her cry at the kitchen table for a good 10 minutes, the kind of tears that are not sad but are an overfull expression of something the heart cannot otherwise contain. Her mother wrote that Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, that the whole point of loving someone was to let yourself be loved again. She thought her mother was right. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the ranch. All 7 hands and Martin and several neighbors from surrounding properties, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica, and the long pine table in the main room was covered with food, most of it made by Caroline herself in the days before with a satisfaction that was different from her ordinary cooking satisfaction, a deeper and more personal delight. They danced in the cleared main room until past midnight, Abraham dancing with the steady, deliberate grace of a man who does not often dance but, when he does it properly, and Caroline thought she might be the happiest person alive in the whole state of Kansas. When the guests were gone and the house was quiet and Martin asleep in the spare room, and the last lamp was burning low in the kitchen, Abraham stood at the window looking out at the dark prairie, and she came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they looked out at the winter stars above the flat land together. "You came back," he said, and she knew he meant something broader than the walk that morning. "You could have stayed at the cabin, you could have found another way. I had 17 cents and a bag of cornmeal," she said, "and a dog." "And a dog," she agreed. She looked up at him. "I came back because I needed to, and I stayed because you asked me to, and I'll stay because I want to. Those are 3 entirely different reasons, and they're all true." He pressed a kiss against her temple. "That's more than enough," he said. Winter settled over the Kansas plains with a seriousness of purpose that felt, to Caroline, not threatening but rather companionable. She had always loved winter, the drawing in of things, the way the world became smaller and warmer inside while the cold did its work outside. The ranch contracted around the hearth, the hands mostly occupied with winter feeding and maintenance rather than the expansive work of the driving season, and the house became a genuine home in a way that she had been building toward since her first morning there, and which now felt complete. She cooked and she read, and she talked with Abraham in the evenings with the freedom of 2 people who are no longer performing anything for each other, who have arrived at the place beyond propriety and arrangement, and are simply themselves together. She learned things about him that the careful employer-employee relationship had not permitted, the fact that he had a genuine temper, slow to ignite but real, and that he knew it and managed it with deliberate effort. The fact that he had, as a young man, fully intended to leave Kansas for the East and had been overtaken by his father's death and the ranch's need, and had redirected his entire life without quite deciding to. The fact that he was, beneath the capable self-sufficiency, somewhat lonely in the way that people who have been managing alone for a long time and become very good at it can be lonely, not acutely but chronically, a background loneliness like a note held too long. She told him things too. She told him about Thomas in a way she had not been able to tell anyone, the full truth of it, the love and the difficulty and the grief and the complicated guilt that she had carried about feeling, sometimes, a relief in the ending of something that had grown harder and harder for both of them as the homestead failed and Thomas's health declined. She had never said that aloud to anyone. She said it to Abraham on a February evening with the snow coming sideways past the kitchen window, and he received it with the completeness of his attention and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You loved him and you were exhausted, and you are not a bad person for feeling both things. That's what it is to be human." She had cried then, briefly and entirely, and he had held her in the kitchen and not tried to fix anything or say more, and she felt something set down in her that she had been carrying for a very long time. Spring came to the Kansas plains in March with a tentative brightness that built quickly into something expansive and exuberant, the grass greening almost overnight, the creek running high with snowmelt, the air smelling of earth and wet stone, and the particular sweet smell of new growth. The cattle were moved to the spring pastures, and the hiring for the season began, and the ranch shook off its winter quiet and expanded again into its full working self. Caroline found she loved the ranch in every season for different reasons, but spring she loved most immediately, the sense of beginning, the world undeniably alive and moving forward. She told Abraham in April that she was expecting a child. She told him on a morning when she had been up early, not with the sickness that some women described, but with a startling certainty, a bodily knowledge that she recognized before she had any other evidence. She had waited 3 weeks to be sure, and then she had found him in the barn in the early morning doing the first feeding, and she had stood in the barn doorway with the spring light behind her and said, "I have something to tell you." He had turned from the stall with a handful of hay and looked at her, and something in her face must have told him before she said the words, because his expression shifted into something she had never seen on it before, something raw and unguarded and brilliant. She said, "We're going to have a child." He crossed the barn and lifted her off her feet, which was so completely unlike his usual careful restraint that she gasped and then laughed, her hands on his shoulders, and he held her up and looked at her with those dark eyes full of something she could only call joy, pure and unperformed. "Abraham Walker," she said, laughing, "you are going to put me down." He put her down. He kept his hands on her waist. He said, "When? October or November, I think." He looked at her for a long time, and then he pressed his forehead against hers, just stood there with their foreheads together, and she felt his breath and the warmth of him and the particular quietness that was his deepest self, and she said nothing because nothing needed saying. The news spread through the ranch within approximately 4 hours, which was the speed at which Grady disseminated information he considered significant. And by midday, every single hand had found a reason to pass through the kitchen and deliver congratulations with varying degrees of articulate success. Dill, who was now 20 and had grown considerably more composed since Caroline's arrival, shook Abraham's hand with great seriousness and told Caroline she was going to be a wonderful mother, and then went bright red and retreated to the corrals. The summer was full and busy, the cattle work and the haying and the ordinary demands of the ranch, and Caroline worked through the first months of her pregnancy with the practical determination she applied to everything, making adjustments where necessary and refusing to be treated as fragile in ways she didn't need. Abraham, to his credit, was attentive without being suffocating, checking on her without hovering, ensuring she had help with anything heavy without making her feel managed. She appreciated the calibration of it enormously. He seemed to understand that what she needed was not to be protected from life, but to be supported in it. They wrote to her family and to Martin, and her mother wrote back immediately with a letter that was so full of joy and advice in roughly equal measure that Caroline read it twice. Martin wrote a characteristically short letter that said he would be there for the birth if at all possible, which they both knew was probably not possible given the distance and the time of year, but which was the thought that counted. In the evenings, Abraham would sit with her on the porch in the long summer dusk, and they would look out at the prairie together, which had become one of their rituals, a quiet accounting of the day and the land and the light. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they sat in the companionable silence. That was one of the things she loved most about him. Copper would lie across both their feet, heavy and warm, apparently convinced that his purpose in life was to serve as a shared footrest. "What do you think it will be?" she asked one evening, her hand on her stomach where she had first felt movement that week, a remarkable and secret sensation like a butterfly in a closed fist. Abraham considered this with his usual seriousness, as if it were a question that deserved a real answer. "A boy," he said. "I think a boy. What will we name him?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What do you think of James? It was my mother's father's name." She said it in her head, tried it out. "James Walker," she said. "I like it very much." "Or whatever you prefer," he said. "You'll have done more of the work." She looked at him sideways. "That is a very sensible point," she said, and he smiled, that rare full smile that still hit her somewhere under the ribs every time it appeared. "James it is," she said. "James Thomas Walker." She waited to see what he thought of the middle name. He turned to look at her, and his expression was both surprised and moved. "You'd name him for Thomas." "Thomas wasn't perfect," she said quietly. "But he was part of my life and my history, and that doesn't disappear. I think he'd have liked knowing there was someone carrying his name forward." She paused. "Is that all right?" He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "It's more than all right," he said. "It's exactly right." October arrived, and with it a chill that deepened quickly toward what the old-timers said was going to be an early and serious winter, the cattle behaving in the particular restless way that predicted hard weather, and the grass going dry fast. Caroline, now large and moving more deliberately through her days, found herself grateful for the stockpiled autumn harvest, and the full cellar, and the solid limestone walls of the house that Abraham's father had had the wisdom to build to last. James Thomas Walker was born on the 22nd of October, 1879, in the large upstairs bedroom at Walker Ranch, delivered by the wife of the nearest doctor who came 15 miles in a cold rain to be there. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Abraham spent it downstairs in the kitchen making coffee he didn't drink and then making more coffee, until Grady, who had seen calves born in thunderstorms and never been rattled, sat down across from him and said with great kindness, "Boss, you are going to drive yourself straight into the wall. She's strong. The strongest I've seen." At 2 in the morning, Caroline's voice came down the stairs, exhausted and unmistakable, calling his name, and he was up those stairs so fast that Grady said afterward he wasn't sure he'd seen him move. He came through the bedroom door and stopped. Caroline was propped against the pillows, her hair loose and damp and her face entirely emptied of everything except a deep, lit exhaustion, and in her arms was a small red-faced person of great solemnity who was looking at the world with the unfocused but somehow purposeful expression of someone taking stock of their surroundings. Abraham stood in the doorway and could not, for a moment, manage to move. "Come here," Caroline said, and her voice was the quietest, most certain thing he had ever heard. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, and he held his son for the first time and felt something happen in the deep center of himself that he had no language for and did not try to find language for. He just held James Thomas Walker, who was red and small and entirely serious, and looked at Caroline, who was watching him with soft, tired eyes. "You were right," she said. "A boy." "You were right, too," he said. "James Thomas." She reached up and touched his face just briefly, her hand warm and slightly unsteady. He turned his head and pressed a kiss against her palm. "Thank you," he said. "It was not enough and it was everything." "Thank the dog," she said and laughed, the laugh hitching with exhaustion, and he laughed too, quietly looking down at his son. James Thomas Walker was, from his very first days, a serious and observant child who watched the world around him with dark eyes unmistakably his father's, and an expression of concentrated attention that made the ranch hands address him, with a respect they might not have otherwise given a newborn. He was a good baby, as babies go, sleeping with decent reliability and eating with great enthusiasm, and Copper immediately designated himself as the child's personal guardian and could be found at all times within a few feet of wherever the baby happened to be, lying with his large amber head on his paws, watching. Caroline recovered with the determination she applied to everything, and within 6 weeks was back in her full routine, now with the addition of James in a basket in the corner of the kitchen while she worked, a situation he seemed to find entirely satisfactory. Abraham spent more time in the house that winter than in any previous year, and she was aware that some of it was the baby, and some of it was simply that he had discovered, after 35 years of living primarily for and through his work, that there were things worth being present for inside the walls of his own home. He was a good father. She had suspected he would be, given the way she had watched him with his animals and his men, the patience and the steadiness and the fundamental seriousness that she now understood was not coldness, but a particular depth of care. He handled James with a carefulness that was almost comical in a man of his size, large hands supporting the small head with such concentrated attention, and the baby responded to it with an equanimity that suggested he felt entirely safe in those hands. The following spring Martin came from Colorado for a visit, arriving with an exuberance that was the equal and opposite of Abraham's quietness, and which made James, now 4 months old, stare at him with wide eyes. Martin held his nephew and declared him the finest specimen of walker he had ever seen, then apologized to Caroline for the inadvertent implication and made her laugh for 5 minutes. He stayed 2 weeks and spent most of them following Caroline around the kitchen, asking her questions about cooking in a way that strongly suggested he was considerably less self-sufficient in Colorado than he had led anyone to believe. On his last evening, when James was asleep upstairs and Abraham had gone to make a final check of the horses, and it was just Caroline and Martin at the kitchen table, Martin looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was a Walker family trait and said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "My brother has been alone in this house for 8 years, Martin said. Alone in a way that I think he didn't entirely admit to himself. He is not a man who talks about what he needs. He manages. He keeps things functioning, but there was something he stopped. When I came for the wedding, the first time I saw him look at you, I understood that whatever that thing was that had been missing, you were it." He paused. "I just wanted you to know that someone who has known him his whole life sees what you've done here and is grateful." Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He did the same for me. He gave me something to be well for when I had stopped being quite sure I could manage it." Martin nodded. He looked at the table. "You two are a very good match," he said, "for people who arrived at each other sideways through a stray dog and a bowl of stew." She smiled. "That is exactly how I would describe it," she said. "The years that followed were full in the way that a well-lived life is full, not the breathless fullness of constant excitement but the deep, accumulated fullness of good work and love, and the particular texture of days that mean something." The ranch grew and prospered. Abraham purchased additional land to the east in 1880 and added to his cattle operation with a careful, systematic ambition that was characteristic of everything he did. He hired more hands and built a larger bunkhouse and expanded the barn, and the Walker Ranch became known throughout the county as one of the best-run operations in the territory. Caroline's cooking became locally legendary in the straightforward way that things become legendary in small communities, by reputation and word of mouth, and more than once she received requests from neighboring ranchers' wives to share her recipes, which she did without any jealousy about the matter. She thought knowledge worth sharing should be shared. She started a small kitchen garden that grew, over 2 seasons, into something substantial, supplying the ranch with vegetables through the summer and fall, and filling the cellar every year with a richness that she took deep satisfaction in. She wrote to her mother and sister regularly, And in the spring of 1881, her mother and her sister Emily made the journey from Missouri to Kansas for the first time. Her mother somewhat reduced by age, but still sharp-eyed and immediate in the way Caroline had inherited, and Emily exactly as pointed and funny and relentlessly curious as her letters had suggested. Emily took one look at Abraham Walker, with James on his shoulders and Copper at his heels, walking across the ranch yard toward the house, and said to Caroline in a low voice, "You have entirely redeemed yourself." Caroline bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing in front of her mother. Her mother and Abraham liked each other immediately and simply, the way people sometimes do when they are fundamentally the same kind of person, direct and honest and uninterested in pretense. And watching them talk over the supper table on the first evening, her mother and her husband, Caroline felt a fullness in her chest that she had no words sufficient for. She thought that this was what people meant when they talked about having a life. Not surviving one, not enduring one, but having one, built and inhabited and shared. James turned 2 and then 3, and developed strong opinions about horses and dogs and cornbread with honey, and a fascination with Grady that Grady reciprocated with a grandfatherly pride that no one made any comment about because it was far too endearing. He had Abraham's eyes and Caroline's mouth, and a stubbornness that belonged unmistakably to both of them. And the ranch hands adored him with an indiscriminateness that was going to be a challenge when he was older and needed to learn some things were not negotiable. In the spring of 1882, Caroline told Abraham she was expecting their second child. She told him on the porch this time, on a clear April evening when the prairie was green and enormous around them, and the first of the season's wildflowers were coming up along the fence line, and he took the news with a quietness that she now knew was not inadequacy, but the opposite, a man going very still because the feeling is very large. He pulled her close, one arm around her, and they stood looking at the evening together for a long time. "James is going to be an excellent older brother," he said eventually. "He is going to be a tyrannical older brother," she said. "He already bosses Copper with no mercy." Abraham looked amused. "Copper outweighs him by 30 pounds and does whatever he says." "Exactly," she said. "He's had practice in successful command." The second child, born in November of 1882, was a girl. They named her Ruth Eleanor Walker, Eleanor for Caroline's mother, and she came into the world with considerably more noise than her brother had, announcing herself at considerable volume, and then looking around with an expression of acute assessment that suggested she had found the world acceptable but was reserving further judgment. James met his sister with a gravity befitting someone who had just acquired a significant responsibility, and then, having held her for approximately 10 seconds, handed her back to Caroline and went to find Copper, who seemed a more reliable companion. Ruth Eleanor was nothing like her brother in temperament. Where James was quiet and observant, Ruth was immediate and expressive, broadcasting every feeling with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity. She cried with great conviction and laughed with equal conviction, and by the time she was a year old had entirely rearranged the household around herself with an efficiency that reminded Caroline of no one so much as Abraham. She told him so one evening when Ruth had managed to get cornmeal in her hair and both of Abraham's shirt pockets while sitting in his lap, and he looked down at his daughter with an expression that was attempting seriousness and completely failing at it, and said, "I have no idea what you mean. You both believe the world is best managed by arranging everyone else," Caroline said, smiling. He looked up at her and the smile broke through entirely, that full and brilliant smile that still, after 4 years of marriage, made her feel something warm and immediate in her chest. "It usually works," he said. "It usually does," she agreed. Grady retired from active ranch work in the spring of 1883, his knees having finally declined to cooperate with the demands of the job, and Abraham built him a small room off the bunkhouse that was warm and comfortable. and from which Grady administered an ongoing commentary on the operation of the ranch that was almost entirely helpful and occasionally insufferable in the most affectionate possible way. He became James's primary educator in the matters of horses, ropes, and the philosophy of cattle management, and James spent his afternoons with Grady in a way that made Caroline think of the continuity of knowledge passing between people, the old hands showing the young ones how things were done, the way it had been done for as long as people had worked this land. She thought sometimes about the injustices of the time and place they lived in, the hardness of this territory for anyone without land or means or the right circumstances of birth. She had nearly been eaten alive by it herself, and she knew women in Millard Creek and the surrounding country who had not been as fortunate as she had, left in circumstances of poverty or dependence with no reliable path out. She thought about the indigenous people of this region, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and others, pushed from their land by the relentless westward expansion that had also brought her and Thomas to Kansas in the first place. And she understood that the prosperity she was grateful for existed within a larger story that was not uncomplicated. She talked about these things sometimes with Abraham, who listened without dismissing her and had his own thoughts about it. And she thought this was part of what she loved about him, that he was not a man who needed the world to be simple in order to function in it. She continued to read and to think and, increasingly, to write. Not for publication, not at first, but for herself, letters and journal entries and then longer reflections, sitting at the kitchen table in the early mornings before the household was awake, the lamp burning and copper aging now but still reliably present at her feet, writing down the shape of the life she was living. She thought of it as a form of gratitude, of paying attention to the thing you had been given and saying, in whatever way you could, I see this. This is real and I am not going to let it pass unwitnessed. Abraham found her one morning over her journal, something she usually kept private, and she started to close it, but he shook his head and said, "Don't." He sat across from her and said, "Will you read me something?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at the page and read aloud the passage she had been writing. About the first morning she had arrived at the ranch with her trunk and her flour sack, about standing in the small room off the kitchen and pressing her hands against the limestone walls, about the strange, fragile feeling of something that might eventually be hope. She read it quietly in the early morning kitchen, with the coffee warm between them and Copper asleep and the ranch beginning to wake outside the window, and when she finished she looked up. Abraham was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, or had seen but never so fully, a complete and open tenderness. "That's extraordinary," he said. She shook her head slightly. "It is," he said, with the certainty he applied to everything he meant. "You should keep writing, you should write everything." He paused. "I want to read all of it." She looked down at the journal and then back at him, and the feeling in her chest was so full she pressed one hand against it. "All right," she said quietly. It was 1884 when Caroline's sister Emily came to stay for what was supposed to be a month, and stayed through the summer, having apparently found Kansas more interesting than anyone had predicted. And the real reason, which emerged gradually over several weeks, was a young lawyer in Millard Creek named Arthur Brand who had met Emily at the church social during her first week, and had proceeded to court her with a thoroughness that left little doubt about his intentions. Emily was 28 and had been decidedly uninterested in marriage, and she found Kansas men entirely more entertaining than she had led anyone to expect, and by September she was engaged, and by the following spring she was a resident of Millard Creek, which meant that Caroline had her sister within 15 miles for the first time since childhood. She had not realized how much she had missed that proximity until she had it again. Emily rode out to the ranch twice a week, and Caroline rode into town once a week, and they talked with the rapid, layered shorthand of sisters who know each other's minds, and it made the country feel smaller and more held. Abraham and Arthur Brand got along with the respectful, somewhat cautious regard of two men who are very different from each other, and both smart enough to appreciate the difference. Arthur was a talker, animated and quick, and Abraham listened to his talking with a patience that Arthur interpreted as approval, and Abraham expressed in occasional dry observations that made Caroline bite her lip. James started school at the schoolhouse in Millard Creek in the fall of 1884, riding into town with the weekly supply run on Monday and coming back on Friday, staying at Emily and Arthur's through the week, an arrangement that suited everyone. James adapted to school with the serious application he brought to everything, and came home at the weekends with books that he read with focused attention and questions for his father about everything from the geography of the plains to the mechanics of windmills. And Abraham answered every question with the same seriousness with which it was asked. And Caroline watched this, and felt something in her so uncomplicated and good that she could not quite call it anything except grateful. Ruth was 5 and insatiable. She followed Caroline through the house and the kitchen garden and the barn, and asked questions in an unbroken stream that would have exhausted someone with less stamina, but which Caroline answered with a patience she had not known she possessed until she was required to possess it. She taught Ruth to bake in the winter when they were confined indoors by the Kansas cold, and Ruth approached baking with a chaotic enthusiasm that produced results that were hit and miss but always interesting. And Abraham ate everything that appeared in front of him, regardless of what it looked like, with a straight-faced appreciation that made Ruth beam. Copper died in the spring of 1886, peacefully and apparently of nothing more dramatic than age, lying at his usual place at Caroline's feet in the kitchen one morning and simply not waking up. He was old, very old for a working ranch dog, and he had lived a full and contented life, and she cried when she found him, with a grief that surprised her with its depth until she remembered that this dog had been the beginning of everything. He had led her to Abraham, and to this life, as surely as if he had planned it. Abraham buried him in the kitchen garden, which felt right, and James made a simple marker for the grave out of a piece of limestone, and on it he carved with painstaking care, because James at 7 was already showing his father's precision. Copper. Good dog, good beginning. Caroline stood over the grave and felt the whole shape of the past 8 years, the desperation and the hunger and the long walk through the heat, and the bowl of stew and the birthday cake, and the book of poems, and the cellar full of jars, and James in Abraham's arms and Ruth's laugh, and the lamp burning over the kitchen table, and the journal full of mornings. She felt all of it at once, and she said quietly to the small limestone marker, "Thank you." Abraham put his hand on her shoulder and she leaned back against him. James stood solemnly on her other side, and Ruth, who was not quite sure she understood what had happened but understood it was sad, pressed herself against her father's side with her face against his jacket. It was a warm spring morning, and the kitchen garden was beginning its new growth, green and bright, and the Kansas prairie stretched out in every direction under a sky that was as big and blue and unlimited as anything in the world. A few weeks after they buried Copper, a neighbor who ran a small farm 2 miles east arrived at the Walker Ranch with a litter of puppies in a grain sack, looking somewhat desperate, his house dog having recently produced more offspring than he had anticipated or particularly wanted. Abraham looked at the litter and then at James and Ruth, who had appeared from somewhere and were staring at the sack with an identical expression of intense longing that was so clearly inherited from both of them that it nearly made Caroline laugh. She looked at Abraham. He looked at her. She saw in his face the same thing she recognized from years of knowing him, the reading of a situation and the recognition of what the right thing was. "One," he said to the children. James and Ruth immediately began an intense and whispered negotiation, whose conclusion, when presented to their parents 2 minutes later, was a puppy they had both decided to call River, a small amber and white creature who looked at Caroline when she held it for the first time with a steady and serious gaze that reminded her so forcefully of a cold October morning 8 years ago, that she pressed her face against the puppy's warm fur and laughed until she cried. Life on Walker Ranch in the spring of 1886 was not the life Caroline Keating had expected when she had set out from Missouri with Thomas and a wagon full of their belongings, and the big, nervous hope of people building something from nothing on the frontier. It was not the life Thomas had dreamed of, and she thought sometimes about what he had wanted and the gap between wanting and having, the way the land could take more than it gave if the conditions were wrong. She thought of him without guilt now, mostly. She thought of him as someone she had loved who was part of the story of how she had arrived where she was. She was 32 years old, and she was the wife of Abraham Walker and the mother of James and Ruth, and the keeper of a house that was also a home. She had a kitchen garden and a cellar full of preserves and a shelf of books, including the Dickinson collection, and she had a journal that was now 3 notebooks full, and which she was beginning to suspect might, someday, be something more than a private record. She had a sister 15 miles away, and a mother who visited every other year, and a ranch full of people she had come to know well. She had Abraham Walker, who was the most steadying and surprising and deeply good person she had ever known, who made her feel entirely herself rather than some managed version of herself, who listened to her with his whole attention and challenged her thinking with his own, and made her laugh with his rare dry humor, and looked at her still, after 8 years, with something in his eyes that was warm and certain and specific to her alone. She had a life, a real one, built not from the dream she had arrived with but from the wreckage of that dream, and the strange gift of a stray amber dog with a Walker Ranch collar, and a man who had asked her to stay for supper and never asked her to leave. She was sitting on the porch one evening in late May when Abraham came to sit beside her, his shoulder against hers, looking out at the prairie where the light was doing the thing it sometimes did in Kansas evenings, going golden and horizontal and making the grass look like something burnished, something precious and worked. River was wrestling with Ruth in the yard below them, and James was reading on the porch steps with his characteristic focused calm. "I've been thinking," Abraham said. She waited, because with Abraham the wait was always worth it. "I want to add to the east section," he said. "There's about 300 acres I could negotiate for with the Hanson family. It would round out the river property and give us better water access for the south herd." She considered this with genuine interest, because she had become, over the years, a real partner in the thinking of the ranch, not in the daily physical work of cattle management, but in the broader questions of what the operation was and where it was going. He had asked her thoughts from early in their marriage, and she had realized that the asking was not courtesy but genuine, that he valued her perspective for reasons she had once found surprising and now understood as fundamental to who he was. "Is the price fair?" she asked. "I think I can bring it to fair," he said. "Old Hanson wants to move to Wichita. He'd rather sell to someone he knows than to one of the land companies." She nodded. "Then you should negotiate." He was quiet for a moment, and she was aware, in the way she had become very good at being aware of Abraham Walker's silences, that there was something more. "I also want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. He turned to look at her with those dark eyes, and the expression in them was the particular thing that she had no word for and did not need a word for, the expression that was him seeing her, fully and specifically, in the way that she was the only person she knew to be seen. "I want to tell you that I know what this has been," he said, "what these years have been. I know what you brought here and what you built here, and I don't take any of it lightly." He paused in the way he paused when he was being precise. "I want you to know that every single day of my life since the morning you walked up that path with my fool dog on a rope has been better than any day before it, and I didn't know that was possible. I didn't know I was missing something that specific or that large." He stopped. "I just want you to know that." Caroline looked at him, her husband, this man who had crouched on his porch steps and ruffled his dog's ears and asked a starving widow if she was hungry, and she felt the thing in her chest that was always there when she looked at him, that warm and certain fullness, and she said, "I know. I feel it too, every day." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers the way they had done since the first November when he had taken her hand against the limestone wall of the cellar. Below them, Ruth shrieked with laughter and River barked in response, and James looked up from his book to observe the commotion with a 7-year-old's dignified disapproval, and then went back to his reading. The prairie light was extraordinary around them, golden and wide and endless, and the Walker Ranch sat solid and warm and permanent in the middle of it, limestone and wood, and the smell of supper on the stove and horses in the barn, and everything that was built and living and real. Caroline pressed her husband's hand. He pressed hers back. They sat together on the porch and watched the Kansas evening go from gold to rose to the deep blue of coming dark, and the stars began to come out one by one over the flat land, and somewhere out in the yard, a dog barked at something in the grass and a child laughed, and the screen door bumped in the wind, and it was all exactly what it was. Everything in its right place, everything earned and chosen and true. A stray dog had found his way home, and in doing so had shown a woman and a man the way to theirs.